Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another webinar. We are now in week 7 of our webinar series, which is great. And so we shall be able to start this morning. I hope that we will be joined by a lot more people because I can see that there are 20 of us and there are still more joining. So as we want to begin right on time, this is webinar series number 7, Gender Concerns in Humanitarian Crisis. And we are sort of deviating a little bit from what we have been discussing before. And this is because all over the world, there are so many conflicts, so many issues that are not just on a small scale, but they are becoming like national or global crises. Right now, for example, in some parts of the world, there's been droughts that have been going on for long enough so that people are starving, people need food, people need help with that food. There are areas in the world where there is conflict and people have been displaced from their homes and are not able to live with their normal lives. In other parts of the world, there is issues that have to do with flooding. We want to just look a little bit about and learn a little bit about what then are the gender concerns in times when we have a humanitarian crisis. So to begin off, we would like us to look at some of the basic concepts or try to understand what exactly do we mean by humanitarian crisis and what are the concepts or core issues that are in a humanitarian crisis. So we're going to look at two important concepts, and these concepts are related, and you will find that sometimes they are used interchangeably. And by being used interchangeably, I mean that sometimes people may be talking about a disaster and they're mentioning a crisis, or they're mentioning a crisis and they're actually talking about a disaster. Now, let us see what this means. I would just like to be assured that we can actually see my screen because I had a little bit of issues this morning. Can someone just let me know that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. So let me just close this chat. So we are looking at the two elements that I'm talking about. One is a disaster, and a disaster is an event, and an event is caused by a shock. Normally, when we are talking about a shock, we are talking about something that is unexpected. For example, if you have electricity on in your house and you go and touch a live wire, that is something that is completely immediate and unexpected, and it is horrible. Because if you have ever touched a live wire, you know that that is not a good feeling. And that is exactly the same way in which we are talking about a shock. People are going about their normal lives, and then something happens. It may be sudden, it may be building up over time, but suddenly there is violence, suddenly there is a flash flood, or there is an accident or a disaster that comes along. Now, that disaster that is caused by a shock results in a crisis. Now, a crisis is because people are not able to manage shocks. Now, if, for example, you missed food today, and you know that tomorrow you can get food, that for you is not a shock. It may be just like, oh, well, I forgot to go to the market, so I don't have any food. Today, I'm not going to be able to make my dinner or my supper. I'm going to go hungry, but that's okay. Because tomorrow, you know that you have the market there with the food, you have the money to buy the food. So you're able to go out and do that. But it becomes a crisis if today you don't have food and you don't have the money to buy the food, or the food is not available, and tomorrow you again do not have the same things, and so on and so forth. What is that happening is that you are not able to manage that shock. And so therefore it leads into a crisis where you will soon be needing somebody to help you to actually eat. So a crisis results or is a longer term result of something that is a shock. Now, let us look at an example. COVID-19 was a disaster. It was an event that was completely unexpected. If you were watching television or listening to the news at the time that COVID-19 started, it was like people are just dropping dead in the streets. This was something that the world had never experienced. Nobody knew how to deal with it. Nobody knew what was expected. We started going into the issues of, can you isolate yourself? Can you lock down? Can you stay somewhere? What is happening here? Can you stay indoors? We started going into that a little bit later, but COVID-19 was a disaster that was human-wide. So let us look at my diagram. If you look at the shocks which are in the blue circle, the shocks that were there because of COVID-19 as a disease, that was the disease itself, but it caused a whole series of shocks that people were not able to cope with. One of these was global shutdowns. Suddenly you could not go anywhere. Even if you were a billionaire, even if you had all the money in the world, you could not go anywhere because airports shut down. You could not go out because you were told to stay in your house. And the global shutdowns then led to economic disasters. People are not able to go out and earn a living. So that means that they're being told you have to stay at home if you want to stay alive. You cannot go out, you cannot earn a living. So therefore, if you're dependent on day-to-day earning of money to be able to feed yourself or your family, then you are in a complete economic disaster. There was an increase of gender-based violence, huge increases of gender-based violence, because suddenly people are confined into small spaces where they do not have that release of going out to work or going out to the farm, then maybe coming back later. So it made situations that were worse, even worse, or it made some situations that were not that bad become issues of gender-based violence. There were increased sorry, that should not be reduced mental health. That should be increased mental health issues. There was lifetime health problems. People could not even get medication. In many countries, because they import, like for example, they import ARVs for treating HIV. That was no longer there and they could not get that medication. And it increased lifetime health problems. People with chronic need for medications like diabetes or high blood pressure could not get those medications. So the shocks that were caused by COVID-19 were multiple shocks and were multidimensional shocks. Now, what it means is that after that, then, were we able to manage a shock or not? Some countries, some people, some communities were able to manage COVID-19 better than others. Why were they able to do this? It is because they were not as vulnerable to the shock as others were. Vulnerability depends on your ability to have resources, your knowledge, your skills, your attitudes for dealing with COVID-19. If you had money to be able to live a near normal life, even during the shutdowns of COVID-19, you would not be as exposed as somebody, as I've said, who needs to go out every day to go and earn money to make a living. If you are able to access healthcare during COVID-19, because maybe healthcare came to you or because hospitals were still open, then you are able to do that. Let me take a simple example. If you look at the shutdowns, the global shutdowns, one of the things that they affected the most was education. Now, in terms of education, some countries shut down for a shorter period of time than others. So I'll just give an example. Tanzania, for example, they shut down between March and June of 2020. That was the shutdown of schools. That was 3 months. A country like Kenya shut down from March of 2020 up to January of 2021. So that means that in terms of recovery, Tanzania, the students were able to recover in Tanzania much faster. In Kenya, students lost a whole year because of that shutdown. So the idea was that we are trying to protect people, but that protection also meant that those who are vulnerable to not returning to school in Kenya, there were higher levels of dropout because of that long shutdown. Now, the risk that was there because of the COVID-19, what risk were we trying to manage? We were trying to manage the risk of disease and death. So the shock has come, it leads to vulnerability. Are you able to manage it? What resources do you have? But then again, you have to weigh what resources do I have and how am I going to use them against the risk of death and disease? So to summarize this slide, we're saying that a disaster is a sudden thing, an event, something that causes a shock, just like I've given the example of COVID-19. But a crisis results on how we are able to manage that shock. If we are able to manage the shock, if we are not vulnerable because we have enough resources, knowledge, and skills, then it doesn't become a crisis. But if it becomes too much, overwhelms, then it results into a crisis, a humanitarian crisis that can either be national or in a community, or it can be like COVID-19 was completely worldwide. So I hope you're able to understand that. Then I can move to the next one. So the world in crisis, what does the UN describe the world in crisis? So a humanitarian crisis can be either one event or it can be a series of events. And these events are threatening in terms of health, in terms of safety, or in terms of well-being. And as I've said, they could be in a community or they could be in a large group of people. A country may have an internal humanitarian crisis. A community may have a humanitarian crisis, or it can be external. And it is not usually described as a humanitarian crisis until it affects a large land area. So if, for example, a family is having a crisis, that is not a humanitarian crisis, unfortunately. It becomes a humanitarian crisis because of the scale of the issue that is happening. Now, before we move to the next slide, I'd just like us to maybe just share. What do you think are some of the current humanitarian crises? Anybody can you can share. Anybody can share what is one humanitarian crisis that you know happening today?
Floods.
Yes, Cynthia, where are these floods?
I mean, if a country has floods and...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Civil wars.
Civil wars.
Civil wars.
Yes, HP, I hear you. Civil war. Do you know of any country that is having civil war?
Sudan, Southern Sudan.
Great. Yes.
Rwanda. I mean Burundi.
Burundi is also having civil wars. Yes, thank you very much. Anyone else would like to contribute? Humanitarian crisis? Yes, floods. Where are we having floods, Tarsila?
Kenya.
Okay.
Yes, currently in Kenya we have floods.
Yes, that is true. Anybody else with an example, a last example?
Yeah, like for example, in Namibia, we're experiencing drought.
Yes, there is drought going on
Yeah,
in Namibia. That's true. That's true. So our humanitarian crises are around two things. One is natural disasters. The other is man-made disasters or human disasters. I should not say man-made. So human disasters are causing crisis for people. When there is conflict, when there is war, this is caused by human beings. When there is floods, and these are natural disasters, but they can also be attributable to human beings because a lot of the times, the changes that we are seeing in the seasons, for example, a country is expecting, oh, this is our wet season and it doesn't rain. Or this is our dry season and it's continuing to rain, and it causes a crisis because people are exposed to climate change. But every time we go back into climate change, for example, then we realize that truly it is because human beings are not taking care of the environment and they are abusing it. So you are right, these are some of the current humanitarian crises. And these are just some examples that I picked up from I picked up from the internet, internal and external conflict. And we say that most of the countries are facing some sort of internal or external conflict. Countries that are completely conflict-free are not very many in the world. There are more countries facing conflict now than there are that are actually at peace. So in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, let's start from the picture on the left. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, 6.2 million are internally displaced by human conflict. In Afghanistan, we have had 46 plus years of continuous conflict. In other words, that country, there are people who are now almost 50 years old who have never known a country without conflict. And this has led to a lot of human rights violations. In the bottom picture, in Haiti, there is conflict, and this conflict is made worse by gang violence because the gangs are controlling the ports and they are controlling the routes that bring in food into the city. And so there is a food crisis that is specifically to the city. But then again, the gang violence is so bad that there is almost no rule of law. Now, during COVID-19, the loss of educational opportunity, during the human conflict or the wars, there is also loss of educational opportunity. In the picture on the top right, millions of children in developing countries, and especially adolescent girls, did not return to school after COVID-19. We were trying to do a small study on looking at return of adolescent girls and trying to see how can they be supported in order to go back to school after they have become young mothers. And one thing that we realized from the data, we were not doing a very big study because we were trying to support a number that we could manage. We found out that 75% of the girls who dropped out in 2021 and 2022. And it is from the two countries I've just given an example, from Kenya and from Tanzania. And it means that when schools reopened in Tanzania, for example, in 2021, many girls did not go back to school. But that is only a small number. We realized that those girls who did not go back to school in 2022 were mostly from Kenya. So that means that when schools closed, they did not go back to school. They just stayed at home. Secondly, because of conflict in Nigeria, the picture on the bottom right, in Nigeria, 20+ million children are out of school due to internal conflict. Nigeria has the world's largest number of children who are out of school. And this is because people are afraid to send their children to school. The boys are forcibly recruited to be child soldiers. The girls are forcibly recruited to be child wives. And so in some areas, there is a complete and total shutdown of educational opportunity for these children. That is a huge humanitarian crisis because 20 million is the population of some of your countries. Some of you come from countries where you have 2 to 3 million people. Can you imagine every single person in that country not being able to go to school? Now multiply this over and over until we reach 20 million people children in Nigeria are not able to go to school. This is a huge crisis. The next one is the climate change and loss of habitat. Now, the one on the picture on the top right, did anybody ever see this in the news? Can you tell us what it is? The picture is from Tuvalu, but do you know who this is and what he was doing? Okay, I'll let you know. This is the Tuvalu Minister for Foreign Affairs. And the Tuvalu Minister was making a point during an international meeting. So during this meeting, what he did was he went into the water in his country to demonstrate how climate change is affecting his country. Tuvalu is one of the Pacific Islands, and Tuvalu covers 9 Pacific Islands. But the highest that you can get in Tuvalu above sea level is only 2 to 3 meters. That means that just a little bit taller than the average human being. Yes, there are some places which are a bit higher, but most of Tuvalu is low-lying. And with climate change, with what we are doing to the globe, Tuvalu is slowly sinking. And the minister went and stood knee-deep in water to give his speech to the nations to tell them, hey, you guys, look, you are actually putting us underwater. So there is a huge climate problem in Tuvalu and in many of the Pacific Islands. But the opposite is happening in many places where, if you see the woman at the bottom left, this is a woman who is going to fetch water in what was once a huge riverbed and now is only a small pond of stagnant water. On the right-hand side, we have changes that happened after the tsunami. the tsunami that took place in Indonesia in 2018. If you look at each of these pictures, this is a before and after picture. The picture on the left shows you a bridge that was standing before the tsunami. Afterwards, it shows you the same bridge that collapsed, the mosque that was standing and the mosque that has fallen down, a storied building that has fallen down, and also a mosque that was once on the edge of the water and now is right in the middle of the water. These are things like the tsunami, for example, could hardly have been predicted. And so therefore, it leads to an immediate and terrible humanitarian crisis. Now, I want us to look at, I want us to skip that for a while and just talk about the gendered impact of humanitarian crisis and then come back to that particular slide. Now, we have said that there are certain things that are happening. One is loss of educational opportunity. Girls are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school than boys. And by the time they reach secondary school, 90% of girls are out of school in conflict-affected countries. The thing that happens is that they never go back to school, and that is why it becomes a humanitarian issue. Secondly, we have sexual violence as a tactic of war. In many countries, women are exposed to extreme sexual violence during times of war. First of all, sexual violence is used to make people afraid to return. Because if there are villages where there are women that the men maybe have gone out to fight, and the sexual violence comes in because soldiers come to rape and to harm women in that village, they are afraid to return, and so they become displaced. But also sexual violence targets women, including pregnant women. And many times pregnant women are killed and their babies removed from the womb because they are seen as the custodians and the propagators of an ethnic identity. So when conflict is especially about ethnic issues, many women are killed because the people who are fighting them do not want them to carry on the next generation of that ethnicity. And so they are killed in horrible ways because it is used as a tactic of war. Young children are also killed because they are seen as the future of that particular group. Vulnerability to natural disasters is higher. It's said that natural disasters kill more women than men or kill women at a younger age. Now, in the tsunami picture that I have just shown you, 4 times as many men as women died in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India after the tsunami hit. And why was this? It is first of all cultural. The women were at home. It was a Sunday. Women were at home taking care of their families. Men had gone out to earn a living or to do other things that took them away from home. And therefore, because these homes were along the seafront or near the beach, the women were the ones at home and they were the ones that were then affected. Men had gone into the farms, men had gone into the fields, or they had gone out to look for work or for money and so on. Another thing is a gender one. Women are not allowed to climb trees. Women are not allowed to learn how to swim in many of those communities. So they could not swim and they could not climb trees to save themselves. And so that's why we have a disaster that is both a gender issue as well as it is already a natural disaster. So more women died in that tsunami. Now, what happens is that when we have humanitarian crisis, men are more likely to suffer from mental health causes or issues because they are participating in conflict as soldiers. They are losing livelihoods and yet they are expected to be the providers. And they are displaced. And when they are displaced, because they were the providers and were providing a livelihood, they are no longer able to go to their farms. They are no longer able to go to their jobs. So when they are displaced, then they have nothing to feed their families with. It causes a lot of mental health issues. But despite all this, there are positive aspects that have come out of humanitarian crisis that have been noted from humanitarian crisis. It may seem a little bit odd, but it's true. First of all, there is a shift in the gender division of labor, both paid and unpaid. When you are displaced from your home, those gender divisions of labor become very artificial because now it means that both of you man, woman are trying to survive, to ensure that your family survives. And so therefore, people take on labor that they did not normally take on within their homes, both paid labor, both unpaid labor. Secondly, there are changes in gender dynamics. You may find that leadership begins to emerge from the person who did not have the power in the relationship. You may find that when there is a change in gender dynamics, people are more willing to take on each other's chores or responsibilities because it becomes a matter of survival. When the humanitarian crisis is over, sometimes because of these changes in gender dynamics, then the family is able to build a new role where there is more equitable sharing of power, decision-making, taking on of paid or unpaid roles after the humanitarian crisis. Thank you. I want to pause for a minute here and find out, does anybody have a question or a comment? Anyone? Okay, we are really quiet. I'm assuming that quiet means we are okay. So, excuse me. I want to stop my share for 1 minute and hey, please. Who's having an issue with my, I need to learn a few more skills. So it is nothing to do with the computer, it is to do with my skills.
During a crisis,
Okay, sorry for that. Can we see my screen, a YouTube, can we see YouTube?
Yes,
Thank
I do.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping that okay. I'm hoping that you can not just see, but that you can also hear.
during a crisis, humanitarians aim to
Okay, just a second. Let me just slow it down a little. They're speaking a little fast.
During a crisis, humanitarians aim to deliver rapid and impartial assistance to save lives and meet essential needs. In our rush, we often assume that assistance and services are equitably accessible to everyone. But are all people affected by crisis in the same way? Of course not. Many factors shape our social roles, power and status, including gender, age, ethnicity, sexuality and disability. In crises, the traditional roles of girls, boys, women and men are disrupted. Existing gender inequalities may worsen and new inequalities arise. A crisis often disrupts men's ability to fulfill their gender role as breadwinner. Women and girls' ability to carry out their expected domestic and caregiving role may become more challenging as resources and services are scarce. When men and women are unable to fulfill their expected roles, stress and gender-based violence within the household may be more prevalent. Attempts to prevent sexual violence and protect family honor often mean girls' and women's mobility is restricted. Child marriage among girls may increase, especially when family resources are stretched. Gendered expectations of men and boys as family and community protectors can increase their risk of being drawn into dangerous activities. Men's higher social status and educational level can influence their access to and control over resources and services.
So what must we do? Firstly, don't make assumptions. Conduct a gender analysis to understand the different and specific needs, capacities and vulnerabilities of girls and women, boys and men of different ages and social groups. For example, girls' education may be limited by gender norms, a lack of female teachers, shared toilets, and insecurity on the journey to school, whereas boys may drop out to earn an income to support their family. Without analysis, we risk reinforcing power imbalances and restricting equitable benefit from assistance, therefore causing harm. Secondly, remember, one size does not fit all. Using information collected, adapt the design and delivery of assistance. Address the different barriers that girls and boys, women and men face to equitably access assistance. For example, you might alter timing, location, transport and communication methods to improve safety and accessibility of distributions. Thirdly, promote meaningful participation in the design and delivery of assistance. Take specific actions to recognize and support women and girls' capacity and voice. Support men and boys to address their specific needs and involve them in addressing issues such as malnutrition. Gender balance and diversity in your team is also essential. Finally, continuously check that you've identified and met the different needs by collecting and analyzing data broken down by sex and age, and ensuring consultations and evaluations are conducted by staff and volunteers of the same gender and age. Crises can deepen inequalities, but together we can ensure our assistance equitably meets the different needs and upholds the equal rights of girls, boys, women, and men.
So that short YouTube video is telling us that when we have a humanitarian crisis, the response to the humanitarian crisis can either help the people who are having the crisis, but it can also injure the people who are having the crisis. Because if we are not taking care of the differentiated needs of the different groups that are there, we are not looking at what are these people bringing into the humanitarian crisis that comes from their social norms, their cultural norms, from the way in which power is distributed. If these are ignored, then it means that then at the end of the day, then women are not able to meet their needs. Men are not able to meet their needs. And within the humanitarian crisis, then we even make it worse. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So I want us to look at this picture that we had before. And I want especially to look at the picture of the 46 years of conflict in Afghanistan and use that as an example of what I am trying to say. Now, in the 46 years of conflict in Afghanistan, there have not only been restrictions that come with the deprivations of war in the country. People don't have shelter, people don't have food, people don't have clothes. Now, the temperatures in Afghanistan, go to winter. In other words, people can be very, very cold. They can be almost freezing, or it goes to extreme heat within the summer season. Now, this picture that we have is of a distribution center where blankets and warm clothes are being given out. Now, I want you to specifically look at who is receiving the clothes and the blankets. Who do you see?
I see a child who is sitting down, a child.
Is that really a child?
Only males.
Hello, I see a child who is sitting down.
Okay, someone has seen, they said they've seen a child who is sitting down, but then the second answer was you see only?
Males, no females.
There are no females. And that is because the war in Afghanistan is not just a war of fighting, it is also a war of gender issues and the conflict that has restricted women. Now, under normal circumstances, when you think about gender roles and you think about clothing the family, keeping the family warm, you would expect to see some women in that line, but these are only men. And so therefore, the question is, this distribution may be only factoring in the needs of the men, or it may be hoping that these men are actually going to take these blankets and these warm clothes to the women that they have left behind. Let us couple this with the issue of sexual violence within conflict. If I am holding on to the warm things that you have, let's say, for example, we have a woman with her children who did not, whose maybe husband was killed in the conflict or who is fighting in the conflict and therefore is not present. And she is not able to go and receive these warm blankets and clothing for herself. She may have to negotiate another way to receive these blankets and warm clothing. And usually within that issue of conflict, she may be subjected to sexual violence in order to receive warm clothes for her children. So these are the things that us, if we are working in humanitarian fields, these are some of the reasons why there needs to be an analysis, a gender analysis that is done in order to understand the dynamics within the people that are to be given, even the issue of food or where they're getting their clothes from, where they're being housed, how they're being housed. And so the short clip that we watched has shown us that because of some of the issues that come within conflict, women may find themselves more and more restricted in the spaces that they are allowed or in the spaces that they feel safe. They're not maybe able to go out to gather firewood. If you look at the camp that is in DRC, at the top left of the slide that is on now, you find that people are living in really small little tents. And so therefore it means that they cannot cook inside. Therefore they're cooking outside, which means that they have to go and look for firewood and so on. If they have to go far enough, it means that it is probably not safe for them to go. And if firewood then is restricted to women, they may use sexual violence as a way to ensure that these women are not able to go out for this firewood, or sexual violence in rape and coercion in exchange for firewood, and so many of these gender issues that arise because of conflict. So we have to ensure that within this, we are looking at what are people's capacities and what are people's vulnerabilities. And one of the frameworks that has been developed is the CVA, which looks at people's capacities and vulnerabilities. Because we know that for every group of people, no matter how disadvantaged, they have existing strengths. You as an individual may not be very well off in terms of finance, in terms of your education, in terms of so many things, but you do have existing strengths. You have natural talents, you have natural abilities, you have something you may have learned along the way. A social group may have norms that help them to cope with crisis. So there are existing strengths of individuals and social groups, and these capacities are related to their material and physical resources, their beliefs, their attitudes, their social resources. And capacities are built over time. You did not know maybe how to read and write when you were born. You learned how to read and write. You are able to see that by learning how to read and write, you are able to think for yourself. By being able to think for yourself, you can get into a career or into employment or into entrepreneurship. So it means that it is built over time and it helps you to cope with a crisis and recover from it. There is so many places where people live. For example, like if we're talking about floods, people have knowledge of how to deal with floods or how to deal with drought, because that means that they are able to exist in a place which is always flooding or which always has drought, because they have certain beliefs, attitudes, social resources, physical resources that they are able to use. Now, the framework also assesses people's vulnerabilities. What are you vulnerable to? These long-term factors which weaken people's ability to cope with sudden onset of disaster, or when there is a long drawn-out emergency. Vulnerabilities also make people more susceptible to disaster. If already you are weak or you are unwell, and then you have to leave your home because there is conflict, or because there is a flood, or because there is a drought, it means that you are less likely to manage or to cope with that disaster than somebody else who was not sick, somebody else who had the strength to walk, and so on. So the very facts that we have, what we have, do I have education? Do I have my health? Do I have resources? Make me more likely to either manage a disaster or not manage a disaster. So a vulnerability exists before a disaster. It can make a disaster more severe for a person or community, and it can even make response of disaster more difficult and continue after that disaster. So the capabilities and vulnerabilities framework looks at what it is that people are able to do, what do they have before the disaster happens. And so we categorize capacities and vulnerabilities according to whether they are physical, according to whether they're social, or whether they are internal. So physical vulnerabilities and physical capabilities, they answer the questions: in what ways are men and women in the community physically or materially vulnerable? What resources do they have? Who has access and control over these resources? So when they are vulnerable, then we say that there is an increase in burden of care work, because maybe they're having waterborne diseases. If we're talking about disaster due to flooding, disaster which is flooding due to climate change, there may be more increase in farm work, because you plant crops, they're washed away. You have to go back and plant them again. You have to go and protect the crops from flooding. And then there is decreased access to fuel, wood, and food. But the capacities that people have, they may have knowledge and use of medicinal plants. So there may be waterborne diseases, yes, but people know the plants that can help them. There may be easier water collection and management because there's flooding, there's water everywhere. And they may be able to adapt their agricultural and food practices. What are some of the crops we can grow in some of this weather that we are now having? So if people are able to adapt, if people are able to use their knowledge and resources, then they can cope with the disaster. Now, this slide will be available for you. Because of time, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it will be available for you. I want to look at the last one, which is motivational or attitudinal. And that is, how do men and women in the community view their ability to deal effectively with the disaster? And how does the community view its ability to create change? Now, one of the vulnerabilities that we have in communities is increase in domestic violence against women. Marginalized groups and women face high exclusion for resources. There may be lack of education for change management, and women may be excluded from negotiations, planning, and activities. But the vulnerability that is also attitudinal in the community is that gender-specific priorities are neglected. So because it is a disaster, usually what is seen is, how can we as humanitarian organizations or as communities that are trying to help ourselves, what can we do quickest? And we look at the bigger picture, and it may ignore gender-specific priorities. So it may take care of the people in order to say, yes, you're not dying from the flood, but it also ignores gender-specific priorities. And when these are neglected, for example, the need for separate sanitation for men and women, when these are neglected, it means that then we have an increase in other types of vulnerabilities, such as gender-based violence. We face exclusion from resources, where women may be forced not to be able, they can't use the sanitary facilities because these are shared with men. They may not be going into education because of the social norms. So if the community feels that these things are not important, I'm talking about both the community in terms of the leadership of the community, but also for individuals. If they feel that they're not important, then it means that the marginalization will increase, and therefore the lack of coping with the disaster will also increase. People may also have assets in terms of their motivation and attitudes. They may be able to sell their assets and services. For example, when refugees are displaced from one country and move into another, in some countries, they are allowed to go out to work. They're allowed to provide services. So they become teachers in the camps. They become doctors in the camps. They become social workers in the camps, counselors. And they are able then to have an opportunity to continue with their livelihoods. They may also have, in that new situation, that ability to learn and use new technologies and techniques if they are willing to. They can use their existing social networks and groups to build a stronger community. So depending on how people view themselves, am I saying, oh dear, I have been displaced, I have nothing, I'm just going to give up? That way, then the community cannot grow and change. But if people are displaced, but they say, we still have our knowledge, we still have our ability, we still have the things that we had before that can help us in this new situation, then usually that community can create change, even if they are displaced. If they have to go back to where they were displaced from, they take back these same assets and the things that they have learned and bring them into the new community. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking about vulnerabilities, the way in which disasters, humanitarian crises can affect or can influence gender issues. And it is important to understand this because no matter where we are in this globe today, we are likely close to a disaster, or we have faced a disaster, or we can see that there is a disaster coming. Your country may be at peace, the next country may not be at peace. It means that your country will receive refugees. That influx of refugees, do we understand the issues that they face in terms of gender, in terms of violence? Are we able to understand, in my community, we are peaceful, but when another community comes in, how do we ensure that these people are able to go back to their lives when that particular crisis is over? So a disaster, a humanitarian disaster, can affect a small, can affect an area which is going to spill into another area and then change the lives of both of these areas, those who are affected directly by conflict or those who are not affected directly by that conflict. I'm just looking through your chat as I'm talking: floods in Asia, drought in southern part of Malawi, genocide. Someone is asking, can genocide be a humanitarian crisis? Yes, genocide is a humanitarian crisis. We're talking about landslides in Western Uganda. So there are so many types of crises, so many types of disasters. And the problem is that now they are stretching the different types of crises and the different types of disasters that lead to long-term crises are stretching the ability of humanitarian response. They are stretching the ability of not just the multilateral big on it. We are not just talking about the UN response or the World Health Organization response, but they are also stretching the resources of the countries in which people are displaced to, or the communities in which people are displaced to. The long-term impact of humanitarian crisis then comes back to mean that you stop development of a country, or you stop the growth or change of a community in order to be able to cope with the long-term effects of a particular disaster. If we go back to COVID-19, for example, some countries are still trying to recover economically from COVID-19. Many countries where, like the example I gave in Kenya, that education was disrupted for a full year. That disruption is like a spiraling effect where catching up, trying to ensure that the country goes back to the normalcy, trying to ensure that those who missed out on sometimes almost 1.5 years of college or secondary education are able to catch up. And that really impacts on the employability, the employment rate, the ability to get from that group of people that you have that the country is still supporting to those who are working in the country. So our important thing to take away from this presentation today is that human crisis is becoming more and more of a global thing, in that the crisis in one area is spilling into another, and the crisis that is spilling into another area is not short-term, is not contained, it is continuing. And what it does is that we have disasters that are beyond understanding. Like when we say 20 million children in one country are out of school, that is a disaster that is, when you try to comprehend it, is a little bit difficult. And then you imagine the impact of those children who are out of school, never being able to go to school. What are we talking about? Literacy rates. Are we then able to meet SDG 4 when we have 20 million children in just one country that are not going to school? So to finish up today, thank you very much for listening. Let me finish up today. This is Kofi Annan, who was the UN Secretary General, 1997 to 2006. And Kofi Annan had something that I have just said. And he said that today no walls can separate humanitarian or human rights crisis in one part of the world from national security crisis is another. In other words, when conflict or human rights violations begin in one country, there is no way we are saying that this is not going to affect a different country, and it's going to affect a national security crisis in another. When refugees come into a country, it means that the border of that country is compromised, and you are not always sure that the people that are coming in are simply refugees fleeing. They may be also the perpetrators of the violence that are fleeing, and therefore cause a national security crisis in a different country. When a country has to divert its food and resources to feed those that are incoming from a humanitarian crisis, then it means that it is also an issue because they have no national food security. They're using their food to feed another country. And Kofi Annan goes on to say, what begins with the failure to uphold the dignity of one life often ends with a calamity for entire nations. A humanitarian crisis or rights violation does not begin with a whole-scale destruction. It begins with one life. One person killed another, and another person killed another, and it led to a genocide in Rwanda, for example, or in any other country. It is because that one life, the dignity of that one life was not upheld, that it leads to one more and one more and one more. One woman was sexually violated during a humanitarian crisis, and then soldiers start to see that this can be used as a weapon of war, and they start to use it, and it grows. So Kofi Annan's words are very, very important. When we fail to uphold the dignity of one life, then it can often end with a calamity for entire nations. That is your thought for this week. It is not an uplifting one. It is something that is food for deep thought. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will stop there. And that is the end of our day today. We have about 5 minutes. Maybe if somebody has a quick question or a quick comment, we can take that. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next week. We'll see you next week for our last session. And I'm trusting that everybody here is actually catching up on the modules, because the modules will not be open long after we are done. They'll be open just for 1 or 2 weeks after we are done with the live sessions. So I want to say thank you very much. If you are all caught up, if you're a little bit behind, please try and put in a little bit of effort to try and complete your modules and then earn your badge and ultimately earn your certificate. Thank you very much. Have a good day, have a good evening, have a good night.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.